Welcome to Compound Insights, a podcast by CFA Society New York. I'm your host, Rob Rowan. Today we're talking with someone who's been thinking and being around the forefront of the changing concepts around company values and beliefs and relating that to entrepreneurship. We're talking with Randy Cohen. He is a senior lecturer of business administration and the MBA class of 1975 senior lecturer of entrepreneurial management in the finance unit at Harvard Business School. He currently teaches 2 courses for students starting businesses while in school, and he co-teaches alternative investments course for HBS online. Randy has previously held positions as an associate professor at HBS and a visiting associate professor at Sloan. Randy, thank you for being on the podcast at this timely matter.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Well, it's always timely, right? There's always exciting things going on in the investment world, the economy, and the business world. And that's why this is such a wonderful field to be in. My brother's a history professor, and the history he studies is the same now as it was last year. But for me, it's all brand new.
Yeah, it is new. Something is always new about it, right? So you teach a very timely case study about Twitter. It raises really interesting questions about corporate values, the roles of corporations, et cetera. How do you approach it with your students?
Well, it was a really fun case, right? And it's super fun to teach. Of course, I asked at the beginning of the class, how many people here have ever sent a tweet? And like 90% of them put their hands up. Now, I myself have not sent a tweet. But it's certainly I've read plenty. And so it's been, it's such an interesting subject because it's not just like, it's a product people love to talk about. And in fact, I sort of would suggest it's a product people love to hate. And I make the point to the students, like, before we get into criticizing Twitter and all the problems and all the complaints about Twitter, and there are plenty of them, can we just pause to say how cool it is that we have this, right? In other words, it used to be that if you had an opinion, you could tell your friends. They used to say the only way to guarantee freedom of the press is to own one, right? You had to own a printing press, right? Well, I don't own a printing press, so how am I going to get my views out to it? Well, I have a privileged position at Harvard Business School where I could write a case study and maybe a few thousand people would read it, et cetera. But but now anybody who has a thoughtful opinion can put it out there, and if other people find it interesting, they can spread the word, and that is really an exciting concept. So I like to start with that before we get into the bashing and sort of tip our hat to the fact that they created this cool thing. And with that throat clearing, now let's go trash them, right? And talk about all our frustrations, right? And what I'd say is that the frustrations, it's been fascinating to watch the frustrations change, and in some sense reverse over time. Now, the obvious reversal is the Elon Musk purchase. And I actually wrote the case and we finished it right before Musk bought the company. And the obvious reversal there is just that, Musk's politics tend to lean right, at least these days. And the previous people running Twitter, people perceived as leaning left. And so people who wanted more control from the top, or let's say people who objected to control from the top, when it was people they thought disagreed with them, then may at a different time say, oh, now I like control from the top because I agree with the person doing the control. So that's a flip that people are pretty aware of. But there were a lot of flips before that. If you look back to, if you go back to the early days of Twitter and remember what it was, the original idea was, I would put up a tweet talking about something of interest to me. And people who knew me or liked me would follow me. And other people who maybe didn't know me, but just saw, oh, this person has interesting ideas, would follow me. And then finally, there was a notion of, well, hey, there are going to be celebrities that I'm interested in, and I'll follow them because I'm interested in their celebrity life, right? So it turns out that doesn't appear to be a money-making business model. You can't actually make money off people just following their friends and people they think are interested in celebrities they follow. What you need to do is what they call algorithmic amplification, right? Which is to say you have to push onto people's feeds stuff that you think will engage them. Because what happens is if I just have 10 friends who I follow and 10 celebrities, and those people each tweet once a day, I'm reading 20 tweets a day, I'm spending 3 minutes on the platform. They can't make any money off me spending 3 minutes on the platform. So if they're going to make money on me, they need to get me to spend an hour a day or more on the platform. And for that to happen, they have to get me riled up, right? So they start pushing content on people. So that was sort of the first thing that's sort of a big change. Okay, so then we got into a huge controversy for years over what people referred to at the time, it seems quaint now, as the Twitter mobs issue.
Yes.
Right.
Yep.
And so
Yep.
the Twitter mobs issue was kind of like, okay, so you'd have a person who was VP of sales at a big company, and then they would say something controversial. Let's suppose they made a statement in opposition to gay marriage. And then people who support gay marriage would come out and say, this person's terrible. And, it makes me think less of their big company and its products because they have somebody like this employed there. And then the company would fire that person. And they'd say, we have disposed of this person who holds a view that some people object to. And then people said, this is an outrageous attack on free speech. This person spoke freely. They expressed their view. And as a result, they lost their job. This is terrible. And I would try to say to people, that's the people who are concerned about this. I'm concerned about this, right? I think it's a legitimate concern that you lose your job for saying something like that. But we need to recognize that we're the anti-free speech people, right? In other words, free speech is you say what you want, and then all the college students who don't share your view say what they want. And then your boss says, I'm a profit maximizing capitalist, so I'm going to fire you because I'm losing money having you here because there's a lot of people out there who would like to have this VP of sales position, right? And I'm just going to fire you and hire one of them. That's the true pro-free speech view, is everybody says and does what they want, right? And then what happened was a lot of people didn't hold with it. They felt like, in a sense, that the objectors, right, the critics, the Twitter mob, should, as the kids say, STF you.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Right?
Yep.
And that's not exactly the maximalist pro-free speech position, although I think those people felt they were pro-free speech maximalists. I don't think they necessarily were, right? Now, I should say, I'm saying this in a directed way to you. If this were a classroom, the students would say everything they want to say, and I would just, let them express their views, and people would be on all sides of this. So I'm just highlighting some thoughts that have come out as I've taught this, things I've sort of learned from the students and what have you.
Yeah, interesting. One of the things that let me just interrupt there for 1 second, because one of the things that I thought was really interesting about the time, I think you were probably talking about around the same time, was Steve Toback at Pew Research did a study that showed that something on the order of 10% of the users of Twitter were responsible for about 80% of all tweets. So some of these Twitter mobs were actually very small but highly vocal groups.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. And this is an important point that it's a big country and a big world out there. And like, if 500 people go online and say, boy, we don't like the way Rob thinks, on the one hand, that's hardly anybody. That's like 1/1,000,000th of North America, right?
Right. On
the other hand, it is brutal. I mean, can you imagine going on and seeing 500 people say that they think you're a terrible person, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And to somebody employing you, reading about it, it's going to look like there's an army of people who are upset with you. And so that is a real challenge for society, right? Mm-hmm. That what do you do when you strongly suspect that the number of people who are bothered by something is actually quite tiny, but you don't know for sure. It feels emotionally like it's a tsunami, and you're running an organization, right? And what you're thinking is, hey, if I fire the person who made the controversial statement, I have taken action and I can't be criticized, right? I mean, of course, you can be criticized by the person who says, oh, you gave into the Twitter mob. But the point is, your boss is going to say, great, you solved the problem. If you stand up and say, look, this is just a bunch of extremists being noisy, let's ignore them, there's a chance your head ends up on the chopping block. Right. And again, people are going to behave, the pure capitalist answer is people are supposed to maximize for the company. And a lot of times that's going to mean let go of that person and just bring in a new VP of sales, right? And on top, and to the extent that there's a deviation from that, people are going to deviate in the direction of, kind of protecting their own careers. And that isn't necessarily going to be any better, right? Okay. So It is a hard problem. It is a hard problem. So here's the thing that's funny though. That was the big controversy for a long time. But then the controversy flipped to something that was almost the exact opposite without any of the coverage noticing that it was a flip to the opposite thing, right? So what happened was in COVID, we started to have this set of controversies around censorship, right?
Right.
So people said, if somebody goes online and says the vaccines are going to do something terrible to you, then Twitter felt like that this was a public health emergency. And by discouraging people from getting vaccinated, you were putting not only their lives at risk, but the lives of the people they interact with and really all of society at risk, because the way you develop herd immunity is by vaccinating everyone.
Right.
And people were undermining that were really dangerous, right?
Right.
And so Twitter said, hey, we're going to block those people, or we're going to make you have to click an extra time to see what they say, and so forth. And then people were outraged, right? And they were like, see, Twitter is even more anti-free speech. But you see, this is the opposite point.
Right.
The original thing they wanted was for Twitter to block the mobs.
Right.
They wanted people to censor those guys. And then Twitter says, okay, we are going to censor some mobs that we think are really bad. And then the people said, no, censorship is anti-free speech. But the point is, so these turn out to be really difficult problems to work through. And then, of course, when it got, that obviously the vaccine thing became more political than I think people expected. And then beyond that, then things started to get really political when you started to have January 6th and then the banning of President Trump. I'll just say one point about the Trump banning that I think was a mistake. Do you ever see the old Spielberg movie Minority Report?
Oh, yeah, sure.
So very good movie, but a flawed movie based on a Philip K. Dick novel, wonderful writer. But this movie doesn't quite make sense. And the reason it doesn't make sense, and sorry for people in the audience who don't know what I'm talking about, but basically it's a movie in which they are able to predict with almost perfect accuracy who is going to commit a crime.
Right.
And then they punish them for the fact that they were about to commit a crime. They don't have to wait until the person gets murdered. They stop the murder, right? So it's
right.
It's kind of great in a way, except of course, that if they were 100% right, that's one thing. But of course, they're only like 99.9% right. And the movie is about Tom Cruise being a guy that they're wrong with. Okay, here's the flaw. The flaw is the punishment is brutal. They basically like hang you in a room, like you have to stay in total pain and boredom for 10 years or whatever. But here's the thing. If they can predict crimes with almost perfect accuracy, the punishment can be trivial, right?
Right.
Just give you a month in jail. That's enough because the point is, whatever, how often are you going to try and plan to commit crimes when every time you do it, you end up stuck in jail for a month? That's all it takes. You don't have to brutalize people for it.
Right.
So this was the mistake I feel that Twitter made with Trump. In other words, the way you do it is you say, look, we have these policies. And if you violate the policy, you're banned for a day. And if you violate the policy a second time, you're banned for a week. And if you violate it a third time, you're banned for a month. And then it's 3 months every time. That's enough. If the person pops back on every 3 months, says something obnoxious and gets banned, how much trouble are they going to cause?
And then
right?
some kind of
they didn't have to make a permanent ban.
Yeah.
Even 1 month would work.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So, and this is the thing that is makes it perilously difficult for corporations, because one of the things we're kind of going around is, whether you're an investment manager who has a portfolio of corporations, they have to be on Twitter because they have to be able to use that part of their marketing. Or if you're talking about yourself as a financial professional who might be in a role that's relatively public facing, well, then you need to be on there too, and you have all these risks too.
Yeah, it's scary. Speaking publicly is scary. There's a real chance you're going to say something that isn't in the company's interest. And by the way, come back to the business side of Twitter, because sometimes students will say in the class, well, look, I think they should just let people say whatever they want, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so now imagine this setting, right? You're on Twitter and you see a tweet, and it is somebody saying something incredibly terrible about Jewish people. And then there's an ad for Per Plus by Procter & Gamble. And then there is a tweet by somebody saying something really mean and terrible about African-American people.
Right.
How enthusiastic is Procter & Gamble going to be about this situation?
Right.
They're going to be like, you know what? We don't want to have that Per Plus out on your platform. We'll go put it on another platform where we aren't mixed in with these things that that associate us with negative stuff that we don't want to be a part of.
Exactly.
And so so from a business perspective, it's a problem. Now, of course, Musk's view was he wanted to open the door to more of that kind of, and we have seen a huge drop off in ad revenue. Now, maybe the answer is, well, maybe this platform shouldn't be ad supported, or maybe a platform shouldn't be ad supported. Maybe we need to have, maybe there will be multiple Twitter type platforms, and some of them are ad supported, and some of them you pay $5 a month, and then you're only in with the people who actually paid $5 a month, and so that gets rid of the bots, and it gets rid of people who are, kind of going to be time wasters for you. I don't know. I mean, maybe the people who take $5 a month are more likely to be time wasters. I have no idea how that would play out. All I'm saying is ad supported is going to create a setting where certain things aren't going to work, right? And that's a challenge for running that business.
Right. No, becomes in a sort of question of functionality. This becomes a question of how consumers work on social media, which has been pay. No, absolutely not. But I'll give you all of my information for free.
Right.
That's
look, Zuckerberg
right?
had this right. Zuckerberg had an instinct that people didn't really care that much about that. What Thatcher so memorably called the chattering classes care a lot about privacy, but that most people don't care that much. And, I do care about it. So I was a little surprised to see that Zuckerberg was so right, but I think we know the answer. And what I'm saying is, I have a theory that, 2000 years from now, there's going to be a lot of novels set between 1900 and 2050, because it's going to be this weird period in human history where we had this thing called privacy that we took seriously, right? It's like you had 10,000 years where people lived in little villages and everybody knew everything going on in everybody's lives. And now we're about to have another 10,000 years where everybody knows everything because of it's all online and stuff.
Yep.
And in between, we had this weird thing where we had privacy and we loved it, but maybe that's just not something we're going to be able to hold on to.
Yeah, I also wonder if this period will be written about, or to some degree it already has been written about mobocracy. We're recording this on June 27th, which was the setting for Shirley Jackson's The Lottery, which is all about mobocracy. So I think this is kind of funny coincidence. So I did want to shift a little bit because you've written a lot of stuff. And, this Twitter thing was exceptionally interesting because of the changing role of corporations and the importance of that in portfolio management. But you did actually, with a co-author, write something that was very specifically to portfolio management in your paper called Best Ideas. And I think it's really important for a lot of people to read because it talks a little bit about how mutual fund managers' best ideas outperform their other ones. So could you give us a little thumbnail of it, please?
Yeah, this is one of my favorite papers. One of my papers. Obviously, my favorite papers are by other people who are much smarter than I am. But this paper is a paper that worked on with my dear friend Christopher Polk, who's at London School of Economics, and with our co-author Miguel Anton. And basically, we had a thought, which was that I went and I did a project once where I talked to lots of top fund managers for doing some fund selection work, fund to funds type stuff. And it was interesting because you'd sit down with a manager and you'd say, well, tell me about what you invest in. And he'd say, well, let me tell you about our latest, hot idea. We're so excited about this. We have a huge position in this company. And they tell you the story and it would be so convincing. They had such depth of knowledge and expertise, and they had such passion and conviction about the stock. And you'd say, well, this is great. By the way, how many positions are there in your portfolio? And they'd say, 120, we're long 80, short 40. And I'd be like, well, you couldn't possibly have that level of passion and conviction and enthusiasm about 120 different names. Your brain would explode from the excitement of it all, right? And they'd be like, oh yeah, well, we have 4 or 5 high conviction bets. Those are kind of the core positions in the portfolio. And then we kind of, wrap it with the other, 116, 115 positions. And I'd be like, can I just have the good ones? And they'd be like, no, you may not. You may not just have the good ones, because there are several problems to running a portfolio with just the good ones, right? And that is, they can't run as big a fund as they'd like to, because if they try to run a giant fund with 5 names, they're going to exhibit too much price pressure and getting in and out of the positions, and that's going to hurt performance. They personally are heavily invested in the success of the fund. And so even though their investors are only going to have like 0.25% of their money in this particular fund, the managers of the fund have, their whole career riding on it, and probably a lot of their money too. So it's not optimal for them personally to be so concentrated. And then on top of that, so those are sort of good reasons in some sense. And so what you'd expect is there should be a debate going on where the negotiation should go something like this. The institutional investor should say, how many positions are in your portfolio? And they should say 120. And the institutional investor should say, well, I'd like it to be 5. right? And the portfolio manager should say, well, here are the reasons why we don't want it to be so low. How about if we put in only 30 and we charge you a higher fee because of the negatives for us, and they negotiate and they settle on 45%. That's not what goes on. What happens is they say the portfolio manager says 120, and the institutional investor is like, could you do more? Could you be even more diversified? And so why is this going the wrong direction? And the answer is, well, because in real life, everybody has a boss. And what the boss tends to do is, I don't want to impugn bosses everywhere, but what the boss tends to do is to look at the report that comes in every quarter or whatever, and circle in red whatever fund has done the worst and say, why did you put money with this idiot? Right. Mm-hmm. And the problem is, if you have a fund that is ultra concentrated, then you're going to tend to you'll be near the top a lot, but you'll also be the one circled in red a lot because you're just going to be more volatile from having only 5 positions. Now, that shouldn't matter in a world of portfolio theory. It's only a small fraction, right? If you've got an institutional investor portfolio, it's 10 or 20% hedge funds spread among 20 or 40 funds, you can see you're 1/4 to 0.5% in each fund. It's just not that much. It shouldn't matter if you do well on average. You should be allowed to have a couple of bad quarters without anybody freaking out. But that's just not how people tend to think. They tend to judge things on a line item basis. This is one of the reasons fund of funds are as successful as they are, because they smooth that out, right? Now you get the line item you get is already the average of 20 funds. And so it makes the results look less extreme. Okay, but of course, even there's a guy at the fund of funds who's circling in red the worst performing thing inside the fund of funds. So this is the challenge, right? And I think since we started working on this, which is now 20 years ago that we started writing this paper, I think there has been a meaningful push in the right direction. A lot more institutional investors are arguing in the correct direction, so to speak, and saying, "Hey, I want more focus on your best ideas." I mean, I had a guy. I did this talk about this once, and it was a big event. And this guy stood up and he said, "Yeah, at my old shop, we called those extra 100 companies the hamburger helper in the portfolio, right? We put them in just to diversify it, smooth out the performance and so forth." Yeah. I don't know if my kids get that reference, but you gotta extend the meat. When I was a kid, people could not afford ground beef, and they buy this stuff, this soy product, to extend it and make bigger hamburgers with less money. And it's just such a So anyway, this is the challenge that people face. And so, but look, at that said, there's a question here. And the question is, do those best ideas actually perform better, right? Because underlying everything I said the last 3 minutes was an assumption that they know which are the good ones, and that they put more, and that the ones they're concentrated in are actually the good investment. So we set out to test it. Now, there's an obvious thing to do, which is just to take the largest position in each manager's portfolio. That's not really a great way to go at it, because obviously big companies are going to tend to be the biggest positions. And so you're just going to be sort of listing as best ideas the ones that are the most enormous companies. So we said, okay, we can be smarter than that. So what we did was we kind of reverse engineered things, right? And so if you think about like the sort of Black Litterman model by which you would, sort of optimize a portfolio, you can kind of run it backwards and sort of say, if you tell me what you're optimizing and you tell me what you held, I can work back and say, what must you have thought the expected returns were of these companies? Because volatilities you can measure pretty accurately in correlations. It's the expected returns that are unknown. And what you're going to find is, they put Nvidia was 1.8% of the market or whatever, was 4% of the market, and they put 5 in Nvidia. But the really big bet was this nano cap company that they put 2% of the portfolio into. Mm-hmm. And so we back out what are the big bets, and then what we find is that those big bets significantly outperform the rest of the positions in the manager's own portfolio. And so obviously it's really important for this portfolio allocation question of like, hey, how much money, what do we want? What kinds of managers do we want to invest in? And can we, get managers to be more concentrated in their best ideas and so forth? But it also, I think, is some of the best evidence I've seen that managers actually do have stock picking ability, right? Because if you look at the overall portfolio performance of mutual fund managers, it's not that impressive. But what our findings say is, hey, even if you just take an average mutual fund manager, they have their top 3 positions are generally quite good and do meaningfully outperform. And meaningfully means a few percent a year. It doesn't mean 20% a year, right? Those kind of inefficiencies are there. But yeah, but it adds
compound
up.
that over years. Yeah.
That's correct. And so if you could get sort of the best ideas of a group of managers, and there's people who have tried to do stuff like that. But again, usually they just look at the largest positions, which isn't ideal. It's not the craziest thing ever, but it's just not ideal. You can try to do overweights just relative to the market cap. That doesn't quite work either, because in other words, if you've got a company that's 4% of the market and you hold 6, that's a 2% overweight. That's not nearly as bold a thing to do as putting 2.1% into something that's 0.1% of the market. And so then you say, well, maybe you have to do a multiple overweight, but that's so these are hard problems, right? But we do our best to kind of tease it out. And what we'd say is, in general, if you can get managers to give you something that focuses, and maybe some managers will do it as like a side fund. They'll say, look, I've got to have my big $10 billion fund with 100 positions in it. But if you'll pay me a higher fee level or a higher salary, more likely, I could create a little fund on the side with only 10 positions, and I'm not betting my career on that 10 position fund. Right. So that's sort of an idea that some people could do.
Yeah. That is, I mean, that is kind of, great competition for the wrap account managers, or what we used to call those folks. Anyway, so thank you, Randy. This has been a very widely ranged podcast, but also quite indicative of the range of research you have written. I would like to encourage everyone to go back and check out on Randy's website the case study about Twitter. It might get a conversation going with you, with your coworkers at your company, about how some of the values are changing in the society, what that means for you guys. And boy, your best ideas paper should be absolutely mandatory reading for everybody in CFA New York's membership, because it'll bring a lot home about how some things you might have been arguing to your boss over time.
Exactly. Tell your boss to call me if you invest in that highly concentrated portfolio. By the way, I'm going to say one other thing. Logic would tell you that funds should do well if they are concentrated, as we just discussed, and also if they are specialized, right? You think people who specialize in a narrow area would also do well. Right. And sure enough, there is some really nice research. There's a great paper by Clement Siam and Lu Zhang and Martin Kapicek that finds the specialized managers, industry specialist managers, significantly outperform. Lu has some other work where she shows in other contexts with Ashley Sun that specialized hedge funds perform better. And so if you can get managers that are both concentrated and specialized, and a lot of you are probably very familiar with the active share research by my old friend Antti Pettiisto. He and I used to talk about this stuff all the time. And then when we put that paper, I was like, damn, I should have thought to write that paper. Antti's so freaking smart. and if you think about what active share is, there's kind of two ways to have a high active share. One is if you're concentrated, and the other is if you're specialized, right? Either of those is going to bring you far away from the benchmark. And sure enough, since both of those work, it totally makes sense that active share works. And so, obviously everybody knows that work now, but a lot of these pieces really fit together. It's been fascinating. This is coming back to what we said right at the beginning, that, when I started in this profession, so I started the Chicago PhD program in '93. There was so much we didn't know, and there's still so much we don't know, which is great. Looking forward to another quarter century and 30 years of learning new things. But at the same time, we actually have learned a lot in this field over 30 years. Like, there's things that we didn't really understand, how market efficiency worked, what kinds of funds outperform. So still plenty not known, but we know a lot more, and it's an exciting area to be in.
I'll say, yeah. So thank you, Randy. Boy, this is a long list of reading for everyone who's listening on here. So in the show notes, I'm going to put in links to all those things where you can find them, because this is going to be some things to do over your summer vacation, the stack of your reading. But thank you, Randy.
Yeah.
And thank you to those of you who dialed into this podcast. We really appreciate it. Until next time, I'm your host, Rob Rowan, and this has been Compound Insights.